serving librarian will lead the first panel.
So thank you all for coming today, and thank you very much, Sandy, for making this event possible. Connecting all the different poems from all the poets from all over the state is no little undertaking, and getting everyone here on the same day is just beyond compare. So thank you very much. So I am going to lead the first panel. What is poetry? It's kind of a big question.
Yeah.
The idea of poetry has long been mused over. Robert Frost felt, poetry is when an emotion has found its thought, and the thought has found words. What does poetry mean to you? So should we start on this end?
Oh goodness, okay. I'm totally prepared. Okay. So I ask my students, I teach college students, and I ask them the same question the very first day of class. And inevitably, they say something that rhymes. Most people will focus on form, talk about lines and stanzas, but then look at the prose poem, which certainly does not, it looks like prose, not poetry. And much of the literature is poetry, and it's the turn of the phrase, it's the way the author writes the turn of the phrase, the way it makes the reader feel. So I think poetry is all about emotion.
And I'm sorry, I did not introduce the panel. So we have Pat Nicola, we have Connecticut State Poet Laureate Antoinette Brunbell, we have Peggy D. Shea, and we have Steve Parlato. So thank you all for being here. So Antoinette, then what is poetry?
I also ask my students this. I begin asking them what their experiences are with poetry, and most of them are quite abysmal. Someone has made them read something that was convoluted that they didn't understand. But I ask them after we do our unit on poetry, what is poetry? And then they have very beautiful lyrical answers, because I like to begin with Poetry Should Ride the Bus by Rick Foreman. And it's poetry in all types of incarnations, where it's a little girl who's doing cartwheels and holding your hand. It's in someone's Safeway bag on the way home, to be made with collard greens and chicken. It's dressed up in church attire, sitting on, and I love this because, I'm a child of the 60s and 70s, where everyone is sitting on a couch that has plastic on it. Yeah, me too. And so poetry is all of those things. And basically, I guess the thesis of that poem is that poetry can be anything you need it to be, whenever you need it to be. I also like what Emily Dickinson said. I know I've read a poem when it blows the top of my head off. So when I read something and I say, doggone it, I wish I'd have thought of that first. We've always seen those lines or read those poems that we so relate to, that they kind of become a part of, our vernacular. We quote lines from them. For example, for me, and for my girlfriends in our little group, if anyone's had a bad day, it's always Lucille Clifton's poem, Come Celebrate With Me, because it has that wonderful couplet at the end. Every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. And so I think poetry is one of those things that morphs into whatever you need at that particular time, but it's made up of language and the musicality of language. And for me, it's also truth-telling and fact-finding, because most of the time, if I don't understand something, I go to the page. And by the time the poem is done, I know what I feel.
Well, I agree with the very wise words of Pat and Antoinette, so I think what I'll do is kind of build on those and look at it from the actual writer's point of view and say that a poem, at least to me, should reflect a lot of work that's gone into expressing that emotion and that thought, and have a very precise way of expression, and a lot of care taken to the words, the music of how the words sound together, kind of weeding out some of the words that pull down that meaning or fog over that meaning somehow, that stand between the words on the page and the actual reader. And I also like to say that I think poetry should be, individual poems should be invitations. It's invitations to the reader to take part in a moment that meant something, meant a lot to the person who wrote it.
Beautiful. This is a tough seat to be in.
I was kind of
He gets to start the next question.
I'll say, I have sometimes been afraid to ask my students what is poetry, because the abysmal experience that many of them have. But I talk about poetry with them as being distilled language. And I ask them, have you ever seen the word distilled before? And the most common place is probably on a bottle of alcohol. So I say, when you look at alcohol per volume, the higher that it is, the stronger that it is. And poetry is sort of the same. When we strip out all of the excess and we get just to, as Antoinette said, the authentic and the truth, and we put it somehow in words that maybe haven't come together before. I also would say, what isn't poetry? Because sitting in a Barnes & Noble and overhearing someone's conversation, you'll notice bits of poetry. When something in the news angers you, drives you crazy, sometimes we turn that into poetry. So I always remind my students, look for poetry around you and look for poetry within you, because I also feel like it's our deepest voice, poetry.
Thank you. Okay, so Steve, we will start with you. When a poet uses descriptive language well, it plays with our senses, captivating us, the reader, with a blend of sights, tastes, sounds, and feelings and emotions. From your own work, do you have a favorite poem or lines from a poem that you hope really touched your reader's senses or reached their inner emotions?
Wow. First of all, I'm terrible at favorites with anything, food, a movie. I tend to really be all about those sensory details in poetry, either poetry that I write or poetry that I'm reading, or and I'm a visual artist, so the sensory stuff really matters to me. I brought a few poems. Maybe I'll just read you a poem. No claim that it's a favorite, but I am. Let me give you just a little bit of context. I'm working on a series of collage portraits of Black Americans whose lives were stolen as a result of racial violence. And I'm on collage number 14. Each collage has the first initial of the subject, and when the 16 collages are finished, the series will spell out the declaration Black Lives Matter. So I'm writing a poem to accompany each of those, and this is the opening poem. It's called Hosting the Stolen. And yeah, there's imagery, right, that I think you may connect with. Hosting the Stolen. For Brianna, Tamir, Cynthia, Rayshard, all the rest. Lacking the melanin required for membership, I have become host to meetings of the stolen. With no preset time or day, they come to me late and early, straight from drive-through lanes and snow-scudded city parks, from Bible circles, from sleep-tangled sheets, from family visits to the treacherous Jim Crow South. Navigating the fields of judgment, river of lies, they lined my squat couch to share their aspirations, their daily joys, daughter dancing, skittles and sweet tea, their undoings. Laying down the weapon of my whiteness, I follow each doomed soul into the reeds of sorrow, knowing I must emerge alone, must ready to welcome the next.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Peggy.
That was so moving, I forgot the question. Sandy actually asked us to read a poem to help introduce ourselves. So I brought a poem that is a favorite of mine, and it's 7 years old and it still hasn't gotten published. And so maybe if one of you have an idea what's wrong with it, maybe we can meet afterwards and go over it. I'm open to critique. But I understand that gardening and light are basically kind of trite and overused images to describe the work of a poet, or the work of any artist for that matter. But I'm coming at this from a different point of view, and the title might give you an idea, I hope so. It's called For Chicks Who Weed. And I just wanted to show it to you because one of the biggest lessons I learned was about line endings and lengths of lines. And this is just a very physical poem, and it's a lot of yanking is going on. And I think the short lines kind of emphasize that. So, and this also kind of describes me, and here, okay. For Chicks Who Weed, this is from my friend Allison. The joy of yanking, bossy, chickweed, crabby grass, unnameable, shallow-rooted, pervasive, invasive, thieves of nutrients and light. Oh, they will resist, they will re-insist, but they don't have our legs to hike up Veterans Tower, embrace the gust to feel the source of power now in the west, curling itself around hills and trees like lemon peels bursting with zest. Light reminds us to lust for life, and then remans us to the garden. So I feel that we can apply the word weeds to any kind of chores we have in our life, but also weeds get in the way. They're kind of like weedy words, or words that get in the way of important words in poems. And they're time sucks. They're social media. You know, sometimes there's like Twitter feeds I shouldn't be reading that's stealing my time to write. But also it's very important for me to go out and seek inspiration when I don't feel it coming at me. And it's my duty as a writer to do that, to surprise myself, to refortify myself with inspiration, like the beautiful art, which I'm going to enjoy looking at here. I hope that answers the question.
Oh, I think so. I mean, there was a lot of sensory things happening in that poem. You know, and you could feel the strength and the smell of the lemon, and you know, those crazy weeds that do pop up in all shapes and forms. Thank you.
May I ask you to please read the question again?
Sure. When a poet uses descriptive language well, it plays with our senses, captivating us, the reader, with a blend of sights, tastes, sounds, feelings, and emotions. From your own work, do you have a favorite poem or lines from a poem that you hope will really touch your reader's senses or reach their inner emotions?
Okay, thank you. There's like so much in that. Yeah. So we know that imagery, you know, figurative language that calls upon us to use the five senses. That's the foundation of all creative writing. And so I'm always looking for the right image, right? And oftentimes I will find them in places I never expected. I'm not a sports person, but I used to watch the Scripps Spelling Bee on ESPN when it was on ESPN. It has since moved to another network. But I would watch the spelling bee because I would hear language, words that I'd never heard before. And then subsequently I would immediately go to the dictionary and see how that could be woven into a poem or a bit of imaginative or figurative language. And sometimes it wouldn't be the word itself as much as it would be the definition of the word, which makes me think of things differently. Sometimes it's Science Friday. I'm telling you, the natural world has a million, it's just fraught with imagery. My first book is a poem about a sea cucumber, which is very interesting because I learned on Science Friday that if it gets upset or it feels like it's being threatened, it just spews its innards out on the person. And so, or the predator, and while they're trying to free themselves of its guts, it's gone, right? And I was like, oh my God, that's great. So that's in there, and birds are in there, and then, you know, in the news, someone was burning covered bridges, so I had to make a whole poem around that. That's in my first book too. I think whatever is in the news, anything that I overhear, a new word that I come across, any legend or folklore is just immediately fodder for poetry. Excuse me. As for favorite, it would be the last word I found or the last image I made. And my favorite poem is always the latest one. Because I will be so thrilled and enthralled that I will read it over and over and over again and just kind of smile, you know, to myself. So I think that pretty much answers your question. I'm in a constant love affair with language, so whatever is the newest found, you know, word or language or image is my favorite.
Kat?
Okay, I think a lot of poems are born out of imagery, things that we see or hear, and it makes us make this leap into another era, another time, another subject, something that we want to express and say something to our readers and ourselves. I'm thinking right now of, I will read a poem, and it was inspired by watching old movies, old home movies that my father took with his 8mm camera and shown on reel-to-reel on that projector, which I can't believe I still have. But I was watching those one night with my family, and this poem came out of it, and I was hoping, you know, it's not only something personal, but I think a great poem can be universal, even though it's personal. And I was just thinking about, it's about my mom, and I was thinking about her life, what was shown on screen, as opposed to what her life really was like. So this poem is titled, Most Times. It wasn't like that. I watched those old home movies, see my mother shot through an 8mm lens. She smiles like mother of pearl, kissing my uncles and aunts on the holidays, kissing, always kissing, and shining like moon glow. She's dressed like a star in those 50s clothes, on her way to becoming vintage. I see her in slow motion, wonder what might have happened if she had caught up to Gloria Steinem or Betty Friedan. Instead, she had babies, cooked meals, folded laundry, then worked in a factory. I don't remember her kissing me. It wasn't like that. Some nights I turn off the lights, rewind the reel on that big metal wheel, and see her delicate light filtering through like dust in the heat and haze of an old Kodak projector that never showed the way it really was.
Ooh. Thank you. So doing research for this question, I am not a poetry writer. I am a collage artist, but I really had to really think outside of my box. So I thank Sandy for this, and I thank you for. So I'm sorry if that last question was a little broad. So in doing my research, I came across an article in The Atlantic by Mark Yakich entitled, "What is a Poem?" And the author identified this thought: a poem practically dares you not to look but to read. I am different, I am special, I am other. Ignore me at your peril. How do you identify with this statement? Do you identify with this statement?
Can you just repeat that one more time?
So I recently read an article in The Atlantic by Mark Yakich, which was entitled, "What is a Poem?" The author offered this thought: a poem practically dares you not just to look, but to read. I am different. I am special. I am other. Ignore me at your peril. Do you identify this statement, or how do you identify with this statement?
Oh, I think we should start in this. Gosh. Yeah.
That's why you're probably Lauren instead.
I think it brings to mind, again, Emily Dickinson in her poem, "Tell the Truth or Tell It Slant." And basically, I'm going to paraphrase it and murder it. But basically what she's saying is that you can't look straight at the sun, but if you turn to the side, you can feel the warmth and see the color of it. And that's what poetry does with the truth. It allows us to actually partake of it, but it's not so brutal that we can't look at it. And I think I do agree with that statement. I would say visual art does the same thing, especially when it's visual art that has to do with social justice and that type of thing. You look at it, you can't look away. And then you find yourself kind of tumbling into the painting, and you're in it and a part of it, and somehow you have to make some type of sense of it to get out of it. And I think poetry works that same way. I think it demands you stop and consider the language and why it's operating the way it is, and then for you to find your way out to some type of being stable again, some type of stability. You have to make some sense of it for yourself, right? And then sometimes it'll still echo. There's some bits of language that float around with you and then become a part of how you move and how you live in your own body every day, because that somehow incorporates itself in you. So I think poetry, I want to use the word dangerous, but I don't want it to have some type of nefariousness about it. It's very impactful, and that's the beauty of poetry, because it lets all of that resonate in us and gives us an opportunity to sit with it. And because it's us and the page, we can decide to have more conversations or to ruminate and figure out what it means to us. I think that's my answer.
I'd like to talk briefly about, Dave and I were talking about before about haiku when we say, haiku are very friendly, aren't they? Because they're so short and they're kind of like those little lovely chocolate covered candies that you gave all of us before. But they do demand attention in part because you know it's not going to demand too much attention. Well, you think you might know that, but actually you walk away kind of chewing that over, and it's short enough that you can keep it in your mind and think of it in different ways. And in the same kind of vein, I don't use concrete poetry too often because I think sometimes it can be a little bit gimmicky. That's when the shape of the poem takes on its content, reflects the content. So for instance, I have a book, a poem in the shape of a whale, and its mouth is just gaping open at the bottom, and it's about plastics in the ocean, and how a whale died and its belly was found to have 36 plastic bags in its belly. And so I thought that was, okay, you're flipping around a page or an anthology and you're like, whoa, what is this? And what is it about? So I think sometimes the shape of the poem can draw a lot of attention to it. Another example, and so that's a serious poem too, so I didn't feel like it was such a gimmick. And here's an example of something similar, but it's a humorous poem, and it's called Secret Arrangements. And it sounds very sexual. It talks of glistens and glides and planes and concaves and dissolves and drips, and it kind of drips down the page. And the last few lines of it go, "Will you still love me the rest of my life if I keep rearranging night after night our dishwasher?" So I think the shape of poems, it can be whimsical and allow, and poetry, a lot of poetry is very humorous. A lot of haiku and senryu is humorous as well. So but it does make you stop and say, whoa, what is this? Why is it different? Well, let me read it and see why this particular form kind of called for that treatment.
That last statement is a really interesting point, that the poem sort of dictates the form. So I sometimes write in form, I sometimes write more free form. I love the sestina because it's a storytelling poem and that obsessive quality of words repeating and repeating. Which also calls to mind the idea of an earworm, when you hear a phrase from music. And poetry can do that, orally, the sounds in the poem, but also kind of like an emotional earworm, where it may seem one thing and you read it and you appreciate it on whatever level, but those echoes that keep coming back, and the way that you'll read a poem and then you'll look at something differently in life, something that you might not have paid attention to, because of this experience that you had in conversation with a poet, you notice something in a different way. My wife this morning told me about a dream that she had last night, and it was about plastics in the ocean, and that the fish were actually transforming into plastic forms. And so these connections that we never expect, but that are so real and so potent. And one other thing, with my students, and I'm no longer teaching English. I took partial retirement in June, so I'm just teaching 2 drawing classes. And what I miss a lot is not the giant paper piles to grade, but conversations and seeing students come awake to poetry. And we talk a lot about connotative meaning and how words have so many different levels of meaning and personal meaning, and how I can't know how every reader is going to respond to every word in my poem. maybe you're allergic to strawberries, and so when you come across a strawberry in a piece of work, you immediately think of your throat closing. And I can't know that, you know, so it's just, poems are, each one is different and stunning and demands our attention in so many ways.
Thank you. I will say one thing at least. So Antoinette made me think that, you know, we're talking about the poems that we can't not read, and sometimes we start reading a poem and the first lines, we know from the first lines that it's very, something about it catches us, it's very disturbing. But yet we can't stop reading the poem. And from that, I would like to just say that I think that's important. I think poets are the true historians because, you know, when people write history, and they write the history books, it can change depending on who's writing the book and what, you know, it could be regional or whatever, and what they think people should know or not know or believe or not believe. And whereas poetry, you can't change the poet's words. They write what they are feeling during their time in their lives, and that is the true history. And the same goes for art. You know, we see all these different art movements, and it is a reflection of the times. So,
Thank you.